unions all would strike during this winter. The strikes even reached the local level, impacting the public directly, as garbage men went on strike, which meant the trash was not being collected. Children also weren't going to school as teachers joined in on the action. Even hospital wards would be shut down by striking healthcare workers. There was even a time in Liverpool when the grave diggers went on strike, which must have been a wonderful time for all. The government, meanwhile, seemed paralyzed by the number and widespread nature of the strikes. Now, to be clear, all these strikes tended to be brief and were never universal or coordinated. Indeed, many were simply provoked by insensitive and right-wing employers with poor management skills. Still, it had the feeling that something very unusual and alarming was taking place, as overall an excess of 29 million working days were lost in 1979, easily the worst England had seen since 1943. The 1970s in Great Britain also saw what was probably the worst of the violence in the ongoing conflict over Northern Ireland between the Protestant and the Catholics, known almost cutely as the Troubles. For an incredibly brief overview of the Troubles, Protestant England had long had issues controlling Catholic Ireland, who did not want to be controlled by Protestant England. You see the problem here. This was an issue both of religion and of colonialism, a situation that would only get worse during the Irish potato famine, as 1 million Irish would die from what I termed in the original version of this episode as British mismanagement and inaction. I say that because the degree to which what happened in Ireland during the famine was a calculated move or not is still questioned. You see, the Irish potato famine wasn't a situation where there was no food whatsoever in Ireland. They actually had plenty of food, but the government of England forced the poor Irish to continue to ship their edible crops and livestock out of their country. You see, the Irish poor for some time out of necessity had relied upon the potato as their primary source of sustenance, which in and of itself was not a bad idea until a potato blight struck. The English then responded to this situation callously at best, as they opted to allow people to die from starvation, as they insisted that the Irish continue to ship food out of their country to fuel the English economy. This obviously made relations worse, as many Catholic Irish saw this as an attempt by the English to exterminate them. Decades of conflict would result until a treaty was drawn up in 1921, dividing Ireland between the Catholic South and the mainly Protestant North. The thing was, there was still a significant number of Catholics in the North, and not everyone was cool with the whole divided country idea to begin with. As a result, in Northern Ireland, distrust between the two sides would grow, as segregation between the Protestants and the Catholics became the norm. Then, during the 1960s, when the Catholic minority began to protest for civil rights, the Protestants viewed this movement with suspicion, believing this was just another attempt to unify Ireland. Protests would then often turn into riots, as the police and Protestant partisans cracked down on the protesters in an attempt to put a stop to their movement, which obviously did nothing to soothe any tensions. Then, in 1969, a Protestant parade was planned to go through a Catholic area in one of the most "what do you think you're doing" moments I've ever heard about. Seriously, what did you think was going to happen? So, of course, the most obvious thing happened and the two sides started fighting, which led to the Protestant police force moving in, a situation that led to hundreds being injured on both sides and the police force being driven out. A conflict that lasted for 3 days, before the Prime Minister of Northern Ireland requested British troops to come in and act as a neutral force to separate the two sides. Of course, this did not end things, as Irish nationalists elsewhere in the country, upon hearing about the conflict, rose up in protest. Meanwhile, Protestant forces themselves, fearing an uprising, clashed with the nationalists. After this, the IRA would splinter and the dominant faction would become more militant, which included shooting English soldiers in response to the British Army and Northern Irish Loyalist policy of internment, which was basically arresting and jailing people without trial. The extent of the support for this militant faction and its tactics, however, is unclear. The conflict, though, would really heat up in 1972 following an incident known as Bloody Sunday. Far from the only Bloody Sunday in history, this is the one the U2 song is about. This tragic scene would play out on the 30th of January in the city of Derry. It was here that the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association organized a march to protest against the policy of internment without trial. Now, the march itself was in violation of an order by the Prime Minister of Northern Ireland banning all political demonstrations. Still, the march was essentially peaceful. However, when some youths threw rocks at British soldiers, members of the Army's elite parachute regiment took off in pursuit, ultimately opening fire into a crowd of unarmed protesters, shooting 28 and killing 14. Now, the British soldiers would attempt to claim that they had been justified in their actions, as they stated in accounts strikingly similar to those from the Kensington and Jackson State massacres that they had come under heavy fire from snipers and other gunmen, as they claimed that anywhere from 50 to over 200 rounds had been fired at them in the moments before they opened fire. The thing was, none of these soldiers nor the large armored personnel carrier they claimed to have hid behind were struck by any of the many bullets they claimed to have been shot at them, suggesting that either these were the worst shooters in the history of the world, people who literally could not hit the equivalent of the broadside of a barn, or they never existed in the first place and these soldiers were lying. For their part, the British government would of course attempt to whitewash these killings, but this did nothing to stop the rage that was now boiling in the hearts of many Irish. Indeed, it said that IRA recruitment surged in response to these killings, as young Irish in particular chose to take up arms as they now believed that peaceful protests were useless when facing a foe capable of such acts. 1972 then would be the bloodiest year of the Troubles, as the IRA responded to the events of Bloody Sunday with 22 car bombings around Belfast, killing 9. Now, a crackdown by the British military on so-called no-go paramilitary-controlled areas would lead some to believe that the violence had been quelled. However, in 73, the IRA would set off a bomb in London, killing 1 person and injuring hundreds more. The Loyalists back in Northern Ireland would then respond with bombings of their own in the Republic of Ireland, killing 34, to which the IRA responded by continuing to bomb England in 74, targeting Guildford and Birmingham, killing 26. Such violence would continue between the British Army and the IRA fighters for the rest of the decade. The 70s in the UK then were a turbulent time of economic troubles and sectarian violence. It was then against this backdrop that a pair of music movements would be created. Black Sabbath had kind of been this weird aberration. They were simply this band that had a unique sound that made them distinct from the vast majority of their peers at the time. Now, Judas Priest would kind of follow in their footsteps, and even proudly accept the label of being heavy metal. But again, they were more or less alone in doing so for a time, as record companies were distracted by a new shiny thing in the punk movement. It was, at the time, this new hot thing, and so record labels looked to sign any and every band out there that seemed punk, as they hoped to capitalize on the moment, and in doing so, they more or less ignored the burgeoning heavy metal movement that was also taking place. Punk rock, you see, was unique, it was new, it was different, it was then this exciting thing that had formed partially in response to the state of the music industry at the time. You see, as we move into the mid to late 70s, the early British rock bands were all getting increasingly wealthy and as a result more and more separated from their roots in the working class and on the streets. As a consequence, for some who were still living the kinds of lives these rock stars used to live, they couldn't help but feel they had grown out of touch with their roots. Indeed, some even felt that these bands were now just a shell of their former selves. Adding to this level of disconnect was the fact that this was also the era of prog rock bands like Yes and Pink Floyd, who were known for their long, elaborate song compositions. While some clearly enjoyed this complexity, there were others who did not have the patience, and even some who felt that such acts were too self-indulgent for their tastes. In addition to all of this, the dominant British culture of the 70s was quite conservative, with a strong support for the monarchy. These attitudes, however, did not extend to the generation of teenagers at the time, who often felt oppressed by their parents' conservative ways. Plus, there was also the economic problems, which I've already highlighted, that these young people had to deal with. All of which, when combined, was a recipe for the creation of a highly disaffected, rebellious subculture. This, then, was the environment that spawned punk. Now, the thing about punk was it seemed to form around the same time in multiple different locales. I don't really know all the details or the timing or any of that stuff, as that's not the focus of this series, and because I do intend to at some point do a series on the history of punk rock. For the time being, though, for just a quick and dirty summary, as I understand it, while the punk scene was developing in New York centered around CBGBs and bands like the Ramones, it was also taking form around the same time on the streets of London, with bands like the Sex Pistols. The English brand of punk, though, seemed to have a much stronger political edge to it, with anarchy in the UK being a clear example of this. Now, in general, the songs these punk rockers created were short and simple. Not only did they play at a high tempo, thereby ensuring these songs were over and done with at an accelerated rate, but they also typically didn't involve more than 3 simple chords throughout their abbreviated playtimes. The resulting music then wasn't anything like the bands who had ruled the charts previously. This was music that really anyone could play. It was not complex, it did not require you to be some supremely talented musician, it was short, it was simple, and it was angry. In other words, it was just what the angry, the unemployed, and the disaffected youth were looking for. Then, on top of that, punk was importantly also a very do-it-yourself type of movement. You see, in addition to being music that anyone could make, they also recorded themselves and then sold their music on tapes at their club shows. They did not need the record industry to get their music into the hands of their fans. Meanwhile, these performances were said to have often had a violent aspect to them, with bottles and chairs and anything else at hand being thrown around. They also apparently tended to spit on things and people all the time. Everything about punk then, from the music to the shows to the style, which consisted of short haircuts, ripped clothing, and safety pins piercing flesh, was designed to challenge standard cultural values. Punk, as you might have guessed then, had a very rebellious us versus them attitude, and the them in question was basically everyone who was not a part of the punk scene. That all being said, probably one of the most important things that punk did was to bring the music back down to the streets. You see, as punk became the popular form of music of the day, they essentially got rid of the bands that had grown out of touch, while at the same time they also provided a new generation with more attainable goals, because the musicianship in punk bands wasn't so intimidating. It was the type of music that had many a kid saying, "I can do that." Punk then very much spoke to other angry, disaffected young people, and they embraced this new rebellious counterculture. As a result, what had started out as a rebellion against anything and everything that had come before them and was popular, soon found itself becoming popular. The thing is, when something becomes popular, it also becomes profitable. So, this is when, as previously suggested, record companies started swooping in, as they planned to take advantage of the new hot thing. These companies were then eager to recreate what had already been established, but they also wanted to sand off the rough edges to make it even more popular to mainstream audiences. In essence, they wanted to take this rebellious little monster of a music and lifestyle scene and turn it into something cute and non-threatening that was more marketable for the masses. Punk rock's time at the top, though, would be short-lived, undone by oversaturation and the movement itself kind of burning itself out to some extent. Between drug abuse and death taking out some of punk's leading lights and others finding it harder to rebel against the music industry when they themselves were now a part of the music industry, punk started to lose its momentum. Essentially then, by the end of the 70s, just like the bands that had come before them who they had knocked off their thrones, punk would go mainstream and lose its edge, thereby leaving the door open once again for a new musical movement to take up that underground mantle. Now, when punk was getting started, there was very much a punk versus metal rivalry. There really was no intermixing between the two groups. In fact, some metal musicians have even stated that they hated punk. But while the up-and-coming heavy metal bands were not directly inspired by punk, the movement would leave a legacy that would have an impact on heavy metal going forward. For example, many of the metal bands that would develop during this time would adopt a speed and aggressiveness to their playing style that smelled a bit of punk sensibilities. In fact, Biff Byford, singer for the metal band Saxon, would later admit that they were inspired by punk and its speed. They just got rid of the bits of punk that they did not like. They actually did this with a lot of influences, from punk to prog rock to even Sabbath themselves. To that end, some of the up-and-coming metal bands incorporated aspects of prog rock in a more technical, almost virtuoso style to their sound. They just took the aspects that they liked from these different sources and left behind the parts that they didn't, thereby creating something different and something that was theirs. It wasn't just the speed and aggressiveness that they borrowed from the punks either, as while some may not have liked punk music or the lifestyle, the fact that they had come from an underground London club scene and taken over the musical world was an inspiration. So if they could do it, then why couldn't others? Now our main subjects for today wouldn't just take their cues from the punk scene, as again, while their DIY success might have been inspirational, they just weren't fans of their style of music. Instead, they would look more towards the likes of the aforementioned Black Sabbath and Judas Priest. That being said, there was another band that around this time really started to hit their stride and would provide another source of inspiration for the burgeoning heavy metal scene in England, a band known simply as Motorhead. Motorhead, kind of like Judas Priest, helped to keep heavy metal alive in these early years, while providing a bit of an alternative path. You see, while Judas Priest went for a more structured and technical approach, Motorhead went for a different, more rough-around-the-edges direction, as even though they formed before punk started, Motorhead kind of harnessed the same energy. Now, you can't talk Motorhead without talking about its bassist and vocalist Lemmy Kilmister, who was actually born Ian Fraser Kilmister, and who was of all things the son of a vicar, which is a senior priest in the Church of England.